There's a town in Pennsylvania where steam rises from cracks in the road and the ground is hot enough to kill a garden. Over 1,000 people used to live here. The government bulldozed their houses, revoked their zip code, and erased them from the map. 5 refused to leave. Centralia sits in the anthracite coal belt of northeastern Pennsylvania, about 2 hours northwest of Philadelphia. If you drove through in 1960, you'd have seen a small working town, a few churches, a couple bars, houses with porches lining a grid of streets that made sense the way any small American town makes sense. Nothing special, nothing doomed. Around 1,400 people lived there, which was already down from its peak near the turn of the century, but it was still a real place with a post office and a zip code and neighbors who knew each other's cars. Then, on a day in late May of 1962, the town lit itself on fire. The most widely accepted version goes like this. The borough hired a few men to clean up the town dump, which sat in an old strip mining pit at the edge of town. Burning trash in open pits was common practice. Towns all over coal country did it. The fire was supposed to be set, monitored, and extinguished before Memorial Day weekend. But the pit connected to an exposed coal seam through a network of old mine tunnels beneath the surface, and the fire found its way underground. Nobody's entirely sure when the flames crossed from garbage into geology, but by the time anyone realized what had happened, the coal seam was burning. There are other theories. Some locals believe the fire actually began earlier, possibly years earlier, from an older mine fire that was never fully extinguished. The exact origin is still debated among historians and geologists, and Centralia's residents argued about it for decades. What isn't debated is the result. Once the fire reached the anthracite seam, it entered a fuel source that stretches for miles in every direction, threaded through abandoned mine tunnels that act as ventilation shafts feeding the burn with a near-endless supply of oxygen. And that's the part that makes Centralia different from every other mine fire in American history. Anthracite coal is dense, carbon-rich, and burns hot, while surface temperatures near the vents have been measured above 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The abandoned tunnels create a chimney effect, pulling air in from one shaft and exhausting it through another, which means the fire feeds itself. You can't smother it. You can't flood it, because water turns to steam before it reaches the burn front, and you can't dig it out, because the fire zone sits beneath layers of rock and earth that would require excavating an area roughly the size of a regional airport, around 400 acres, spreading outward at approximately 75 feet per year. 75 feet per year. That's about the length of a tractor trailer, annually. Slow enough that you could ignore it for a decade. Fast enough that the fire would be under your kitchen inside a generation. For the first several years, most residents did ignore it. The fire was underground. You couldn't see it. If your basement got warm or your garden stopped growing, maybe you blamed the weather. But the signs kept building. Sinkholes opened in yards and along roads. Residents reported sulfur smells seeping through foundations. Carbon monoxide, odorless and invisible, began accumulating in basements and crawl spaces at dangerous concentrations. The moment the rest of the country started paying attention came in February of 1981, when a 12-year-old named Todd Domboski was walking through his grandmother's backyard, and the ground opened beneath him. A sinkhole, 4 feet wide, swallowed him up to his armpits. Below him was a steaming cavity laced with lethal levels of carbon monoxide. His cousin pulled him out. He survived. But the image, a kid nearly swallowed by the earth in his own backyard, was the kind of story that makes the national news. And here's the thing about the fire that most people miss. It wasn't some freak geological event that caught a town off guard. Coal region mine fires were a known hazard. Pennsylvania had dealt with them before. Small ones broke out, got contained, got extinguished. The Centralia fire could have been one of those. In 1962, when the burn was still confined to a small area near the dump, it was a local problem with a local solution. A proper excavation of the fire zone in those early months might have cost a few $100,000 and saved the town entirely. But Centralia in 1962 was a coal town without a coal industry. The mines had closed. The population was already shrinking. The tax base was thin. The borough didn't have the money to fight a subsurface fire, and the agencies that did have the money didn't move fast enough. Early containment projects were started, stalled, underfunded, and abandoned, and in at least one case, the digging itself made things worse. Trenching into the earth to cut off the fire introduced fresh oxygen to the burn zone. The fire jumped the line. By the time federal attention and federal dollars arrived, the window for containment had closed. Engineers estimated that fully excavating the fire would cost somewhere in the range of $663 million for a town of 1,400 people. The math was brutal, and the math won. That's the detail that changes the story. The fire didn't chase people out of Centralia. The fire crept. It moved in geologic time, inches per day, while people mowed their lawns above it. What actually emptied the town was a series of decisions about money, about jurisdiction, about who was responsible for a fire burning in tunnels that nobody owned, that turned a solvable problem into a permanent one. And once the fire became permanent, the only question left was what to do with the people living on top of it. The federal government's answer arrived in 1984. Not a fix, a check. Congress approved a relocation package worth roughly $42 million. The idea was straightforward. Buy out every homeowner in Centralia, move them somewhere else, and demolish the town. It was, by the numbers, the rational choice. Excavating the fire would have cost more than 15 times as much, and there was no guarantee it would even work. So instead of saving the town, they offered to erase it. Most residents took the deal. Not because they wanted to, because the alternative was staying in a place where the ground was getting hotter, the sinkholes were getting wider, and the carbon monoxide readings in some basements had reached levels that could kill a person in their sleep. Between the mid-1980s and early 1990s, the bulk of Centralia's remaining population packed up and left. Houses were knocked down, streets were pulled up, foundations were filled in with dirt. Block by block, the town grid went from buildings to grass. But here's what the buyout actually looked like from the inside, and this is the part the aerial footage never shows. The government didn't offer market value for every home. It offered appraised value. And in a town sitting on top of a fire that had been national news for years, those appraisals came in low. Some homeowners were offered amounts that, even by 1980 standards, fell well short of what a comparable house in any neighboring town would cost. Taking the money didn't mean relocating. For some families, it meant downgrading. You'd leave a paid-off house your grandparents built and move into a smaller place with a mortgage. The buyout was framed as a rescue. For a lot of people, it felt more like a forced sale at a discount. And the process wasn't clean. It was slow, inconsistent, and divisive. Some residents wanted to leave early and felt the government dragged its feet. Others wanted to stay and felt pressured out. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades found themselves on opposite sides of a question that had no good answer. Do you fight for the town, or do you take the check and go? Families split over it. Friendships ended. The fire had been burning underground for 20 years. But the relocation program managed to tear the community apart at the surface in half that time. The mechanics of how a town gets deleted are stranger than you'd think. It doesn't happen all at once. First, the people leave. Not everyone, but enough that the critical mass disappears. Once enough houses are empty, the post office closes. Once the post office closes, there's no mail delivery. Once there's no mail delivery, the zip code becomes a formality. Centralia's zip code, 17927, was officially revoked in 2002, 40 years after the fire started. The town didn't just lose its residents, it lost its address. Municipal services followed the same slow drain. When the population dropped below the threshold needed to sustain a local government, the borough effectively stopped functioning. Police coverage shifted to state troopers. Water and sewer maintenance became a question nobody wanted to answer. Streets that had already been torn up weren't going to be repaved. The infrastructure of daily life, the invisible stuff you never think about until it's gone, evaporated piece by piece, and each piece that disappeared made it harder for anyone still there to justify staying. This is the mechanism that most accounts of Centralia understate. The fire didn't make the town unlivable all at once. The fire made the town expensive to maintain, which made the government unwilling to maintain it, which triggered a relocation that removed the tax base, which killed the services, which made the town unlivable. It was a chain reaction, and the fire was only the first link. Everything after that was human. By the late 1990s, Centralia looked less like a town and more like a riddle. A few dozen structures still stood, scattered across a grid of empty lots where houses used to be. Roads led to nothing. Driveways ended at grass. The churches, there were several, because this was coal country, Pennsylvania, and every ethnic parish had its own, lasted longer than the houses, maintained by congregations that had moved away but still drove back for services. Faith outlived geography, at least for a while, and through all of it, a handful of residents refused to move. Not a neighborhood's worth. Not a block. A handful. They watched the bulldozers take down the house next door. They watched the street signs come down. They watched the post office close and the zip code disappear and the town get removed from maps, and they stayed. The obvious question is, why? The fire was real. The danger was documented. The money was on the table. Why would anyone choose to remain in a town that was being actively dismantled around them? The obvious answer, stubbornness, sentiment, denial, is the one most outsiders land on. It's also wrong. Or at least, it's so incomplete that it might as well be wrong. Because the holdouts didn't just refuse to leave. They organized. They hired lawyers. They went to court. And their argument wasn't that the fire didn't exist. Their argument was that the deal was bad, the process was coerced, and the government was taking more than it was giving. That fight, the legal battle over who really owns a town that's on fire, lasted longer than most people realize. The residents who stayed weren't a random cross-section of Centralia. They were, almost without exception, people who had been there the longest, families with roots going back generations in the anthracite region, people who had watched the coal industry rise and collapse, and who understood, in a way that outside engineers and government appraisers did not, exactly what their homes and their land were worth. Not just in dollars, in continuity. In the fact that their grandparents had built these houses, that the cemetery up the hill held family names going back a century, and that leaving meant severing something that couldn't be reassembled somewhere else with a relocation check. But this wasn't just emotion. The holdouts had a practical grievance, and it was sharp. When the government condemned Centralia's properties under eminent domain, it didn't just take the houses, it took the land. And beneath that land sat something the appraisals never fully accounted for: mineral rights. The anthracite coal seam, the same one that was burning, still had commercial value in theory. And when the state took possession of the condemned properties, the question of who controlled those subsurface rights became a flashpoint. Several holdouts believed, and said publicly, that the condemnation was as much about acquiring the mineral rights beneath Centralia as it was about protecting residents from the fire. The state disputed this, saying mineral ownership was far from clear. But given the history of coal country land disputes in Pennsylvania, the suspicion wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. The buyout prices reinforced the distrust. Some homeowners were offered amounts that, even by 1980s standards, fell well short of what a comparable house in any neighboring town would cost. The government's position was that the fire had destroyed the market value. The homeowner's position was that the government had destroyed the market value by publicizing the danger, condemning the area, and removing the services that made the properties functional. It was a closed loop. The fire made the town dangerous. The danger made the homes worthless, and the worthlessness justified a lowball offer. If you were sitting on a paid-off house your family had owned for 60 years, and someone handed you a check that wouldn't cover a down payment on a new place in the next town over, you might refuse too. So they fought. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the holdouts challenged the condemnation in court. They argued that their specific properties were not in immediate danger, that the fire's advance was slow enough and far enough from their homes that the blanket condemnation was overreach. And in some cases, they were right. The fire hadn't reached every corner of Centralia equally. Some houses sat on ground that wasn't directly above the burn zone. The danger was real, but it wasn't uniform, and painting the entire borough with the same brush made the legal case more vulnerable than the government expected. The fight dragged on for years. Administrations changed. Attorneys cycled in and out. The holdouts aged, and the town continued to disappear around them. By the 2000s, the number of remaining residents had dropped into the single digits. The streetscape had gone from sparse to surreal, a few occupied houses separated by acres of empty lots, like a row of teeth with most of them missing. No stores, no post office, no municipal government to speak of. The holdouts were living in a place that had every physical characteristic of a ghost town except for the fact that they were still in it. In 2013, after decades of legal wrangling, Pennsylvania reached a settlement with the remaining residents. The terms were simple in the way that surrender terms are simple. The holdouts could stay in their homes for the rest of their natural lives. They would not be forced out. But when they died, or when they voluntarily left, their properties would revert to the state. They could live there. They could not sell. They could not pass the houses on to their children. They had won the right to stay, but only on a clock that ended with them. That agreement is still in effect. As of recent counts, somewhere between 5 and 7 people remain in Centralia. The exact number fluctuates, and nobody's conducting a formal census of a town that no longer officially exists. They live in houses that still have electricity and well water, though municipal services are a memory. Their mail goes to a P.O. box in a neighboring town. Their street addresses point to roads that don't appear on most maps. They exist in a legal and geographic gray zone, residents of a place with no zip code, homeowners who can't sell, citizens of a borough that has no functioning government. And here's the part that outsiders almost always get wrong. The holdouts aren't living in denial of the fire. They know the fire is there. They've known longer than anyone. They felt the heat in their basements before the national media showed up, before the engineers drilled boreholes, before Congress wrote the check. What they're denying isn't the fire. It's the premise that the fire justified what came after. The lowball appraisals, the condemned properties, the demolished houses, the revoked zip code, the erasure of a place that was still, by their measure, home. Their greatest enemy was never the geology. It was the math of critical mass. A town can survive a fire. A town cannot survive the departure of 95% of its residents. Once the neighbors left and the stores closed and the post office shut down and the streets stopped being maintained, the holdouts weren't living in Centralia anymore. They were living in the memory of it, a memory they maintained by the simple, radical act of not leaving. Whether that's heroic or futile depends entirely on what you think a town is. If a town is infrastructure, pipes, roads, services, a tax base, then Centralia died decades ago and the holdouts are living in its ruins. But if a town is the decision to stay, then Centralia is still alive, barely, carried by a handful of people who looked at a burning coal seam and a government buyout and a bulldozed neighborhood and said no. That sounds like an ending. It isn't. Because the strangest chapter of Centralia's story isn't the fire, and it isn't the holdouts. It's what's happening right now, 60 years in, as the last residents age out, and the land starts becoming something that nobody in 1962 could have predicted. If you visit Centralia today, and thousands of people do, every year, the first thing you notice is how quiet it is. Not rural quiet, not small town quiet. The quiet of a place where a town used to be and the land hasn't figured out what to do next. You drive in on roads that still have names, but lead past empty lots where the grass has grown thick over old foundations. Here and there, a set of concrete steps rises out of the ground and stops, stares to a front door that doesn't exist anymore, leading into a house that was knocked down 30 years ago. It looks like a cemetery without headstones. The second thing you notice, if you come in winter, is the steam. It rises from cracks in the ground along old Route 61, curling through the cold air in thin white threads that look almost peaceful until you remember what's producing them. The earth beneath your feet is hot, not metaphorically. The subsurface temperature in some areas has been measured at several hundred degrees. You are standing on a slow-motion furnace that has been burning since before most of the people visiting were born. For years, the biggest draw was the graffiti highway, a stretch of the old Route 61 alignment that had been abandoned and rerouted in 1993 after the roadbed became too unstable from the heat and subsidence below. With no traffic and no maintenance, the orphaned asphalt became a canvas. People drove from hours away to spray paint messages, names, and artwork across the cracked surface. It became one of the most photographed roads in Pennsylvania, which is an odd distinction for a road that no longer goes anywhere. In 2020, the property owner buried it under truckloads of dirt, a second erasure of a road that had already been erased once. Centralia has a habit of getting deleted and then getting deleted again. The tourists still come, though. They walk the empty grid. They photograph the steam vents. They pose next to the few remaining structures. Some come because they've heard the persistent claim that Centralia inspired the horror franchise Silent Hill, a connection the game's original creators have flatly denied, though the film adaptation did draw on Centralia's story and the association stuck in the public imagination. Whether or not the link is real, it turned a dying coal town into a cultural reference point, which is more than most towns of 1,500 people ever manage. And this is where the story bends in a direction nobody planned for. Centralia is now more visited as a ghost town than it ever was as a functioning borough. It has become a destination precisely because it was destroyed, a place people seek out not for what's there, but for what isn't. The absence is the attraction. Every empty lot, every set of orphaned stairs, every thread of steam from the ground is a marker of something removed, and the removal itself is what people want to see. Centralia didn't become famous for coal, or for its churches, or for anything it built. It became famous for disappearing. Meanwhile, the fire doesn't care about any of this. It burns the way it has burned since 1962, slowly, steadily, indifferent to buyouts and court cases and tourists and film crews. Current estimates suggest the anthracite seam beneath Centralia contains enough fuel to sustain the fire for another 250 years, possibly longer. That number is worth sitting with. If the projections hold, the fire will still be burning in the year 2260, a date nearly a quarter millennium away. The town of Centralia existed as a populated, functioning community for about a century and a half. The fire beneath it will burn for at least twice that long. That reframes everything. Centralia is not a town that was destroyed by a fire. It is a fire that briefly had a town on top of it. The humans arrived, extracted coal for a few generations, built houses and churches and schools above the seam, and then, through a combination of accident, neglect, bureaucratic failure, and geological inevitability, set the thing they were standing on ablaze. The fire didn't invade. It was always there, locked in the carbon of the coal, waiting for oxygen and a spark. The 1962 trash burn didn't create the fire. It introduced the fire to itself. The holdouts understand this better than anyone, even if they wouldn't put it in those terms. They've watched the cycle from inside. The boom, The bust, the fire, the failed fixes, the buyouts, the bulldozers, the tourists, the silence. They are the last living connection between Centralia as a place where people lived and Centralia as a geological event that people visit. When they're gone, and the 2013 settlement guarantees that their departure is a matter of years, not generations, the state will take the land. The remaining houses will come down, and the final thread connecting human memory to physical ground will snap. What comes after that is a question nobody has fully answered. The state has no published master plan for post-resident Centralia. The fire will continue to be monitored, boreholes drilled periodically, temperatures logged, gas levels checked, but monitoring isn't managing, and the fire isn't going to stop because someone's watching it. The land itself will likely return to something resembling forest, the way old coal patches across Pennsylvania have slowly been reclaimed by trees over the past century. In 50 years, you might drive past Centralia and see nothing but woods. No streets, no foundations, no stairs going nowhere. Just green canopy over hot ground. There's a version of this story that ends in tragedy. A town killed by a fire, residents scattered, community lost. And that version is true. But there's another version that's also true, and it's stranger. Centralia was always temporary, not because of the fire, because of the coal. The town existed as long as the resource existed, and when the resource ran out, the town was already shrinking. The fire accelerated what economics had started. It compressed a century of slow decline into a few violent decades and left behind something no zoning law has a category for. A place that is simultaneously a ghost town, a tourist attraction, a legal gray zone, a geological hazard, and a slow-motion return to Earth. 5 people still live there. The fire still burns beneath them. On a cold January morning, steam rises from the cracks in the road and disappears into air that smells faintly of sulfur. No sound, no cars. The land doing what it was always going to do, just hotter, and with no one left to watch.